Well, as we said in the language of the canons, it had come to the attention of the bishops of the church that there had to be some regulations placed on the ascetic life, the monastic communities. And we read in the accounts, we read in the regional councils, besides the great ecumenical councils, there are regional councils held in the 4th century and their decisions are embraced. Gangra, Carthage, there are a number of them. Their decisions are embraced by the ecumenical councils, and there's some regulations placed upon who goes to the monastery. If you're married, you can't go unless you have the consent of your spouse. You cannot engage in physical acts of mutilation of the body for expressions of repentance. If you do that, you're going to be excommunicated. Such as to do that is not according to the will of God. You can't embrace the monastic life. The Council of Gangra says, Regional Council of Gangra in Asia Minor says, that if someone embraces the ascetic life because he or she holds marriage in contempt, he is to be excommunicated. That even though the embracing of the ascetic life is considered to be a response to the invitation to the life of evangelical perfection, nevertheless it can never be understood as looking down upon the ordinary married people of the church, that the two must be in harmony in the church for there to be health. In the meantime, some of the more learned monks, and this is, we'll stop on this subject for tonight here, are becoming engaged in what's going to be one of the next controversies of the church. And that is that they are becoming intensely formed by the writings of one that we've mentioned already, the great teacher Origen of the 3rd century. And particularly in the expression of what has been understood, what has been called contemplative prayer in the church. There is a man whose name is Evagrius, and this man is very instrumental in articulating what has become, even though in some ways the expression is an extreme expression. Nevertheless, much of the Orthodox spiritual literature in the Philokalia has its roots in the teachings of Evagrius concerning prayer, that there are various levels of prayer through which a person is called to ascend, from vocal prayer to mental prayer to the prayer that is silent without images, what will later be called either the prayer of the heart or contemplation, infused prayer. That one is to attempt to rise to this expression of prayer that is without any kind of word or mental image. And there are some who took this spiritual teaching. It's described as in Greek from praxis to theoria, from the prayer that requires one's own energy to the prayer that is given to someone whose mind and heart is purified of all the passions, the prayer that is infused in them by the grace of the Holy Spirit. And although this understanding of the various levels of prayer was embraced and by the church, approved and taught by the church, nevertheless, there were those who took it to such an extreme that they said that physical things in the church, such as the sacraments, liturgical services, visual images, all of these things are only for the kind of people in the lower echelons of the life of prayer. And once you come to be more and more spiritual, you lay these things aside. And the church had to take a very strict approach to those who thought that a high level of contemplative prayer dispensed with the need for the sacraments. And rather, the the ultimate expression of the monastic prayer is that it is within the experience of the sacraments, within particularly the being united to Christ in the church through the Holy Eucharist, that the ultimate expression of contemplative prayer is to be found, not apart from the sacraments, but rather within the sacraments and through the sacraments, that as one's life is purified of passions. And it's Evagrius who first kind of classifies the passions into the 7 deadly sins, the various sorts of movements of the soul and emotions, from which, if one is going to advance to the purest expressions of prayer, one must reach this dispassion, which is to be freed from any of the influence of the lower fallen passions. Teaching of Evagrius is central to what will become the spiritual literature, spiritual tradition of the church. But there were also those who admiring Origen, and here we must again make the distinction between Origen himself and some of his writings, and then the people who read some of his writings and applied some of his writings the way they wanted, in again a kind of extreme ascetic expression that regarded as contemptible any use of material things, material images in prayer. They went too far with that, and it's going to cause some difficulty in the church of the next century. So that's an outline of the rise of the monastic movement. And then our second subject this evening that we'll have to deal with somewhat more briefly is the emergence of and development of the church's liturgy, church's worship. Because as we're going to see, or as we've seen partially already in that account of all of those articles confiscated from the church in North Africa during the persecution under Diocletian, what emerges from basically the house churches of the 3rd and early 4th century at the conclusion of the persecutions is a very developed life of liturgical worship that focuses on, first of all, the Lord's Day as the origin of everything in the church's liturgy, because it's the day of the Lord's resurrection, but also includes the liturgy that we would call the sanctification of time, prayer at various times of the day, traditionally 7 times, early in the morning, and then at the various hours that marked the Roman day, 1st, 3rd, 6th, and 9th. That's our equivalent of 6, 9, noon, and 3. Evening, and then in the middle of the night. And we also find already in the 3rd and 4th century the beginning of what is called the church year, revolving around the great celebrations of Pascha and Pentecost, but also by this time including the beginnings of what will later be called Holy Week and Lent, and already the beginnings of the celebrations in honor of the saints have come, the keeping of the memorials of the saints. Already from the 2nd century we see that the Christians, when they bury St. Polycarp, look forward to the annual celebration of his memorial. Also, in the 3rd and 4th century, we find the emergence of a celebration in the winter of the birth and the baptism of Christ, called the Epiphany, the celebration of the coming or the manifestation of Christ to the world. And it's celebrated on various days. In the Greek church, it's celebrated primarily, the Greek-speaking church in Palestine, Asia Minor, Egypt. It's celebrated on the 6th of January, which was the time when following the winter solstice, the days are becoming longer. In Rome, it's celebrated on the 25th of December for the same reason, that some scholars have proposed a theory that because at the winter solstice, a festival was celebrated in honor of the sun god, that the Christians kind of took that over and made it a celebration of the birth of Christ at the time when the days were getting longer. But there are scholars now who say that actually there's evidence for the Christians celebrating at the winter solstice the birth of Christ even antedates the celebration in honor of the sun god. So you can't take any of these theories too absolutely. In any event, in the 2nd and 3rd century, a second great celebration of the church, this time in honor of the Incarnation, focusing on the birth of the Lord on the 25th of December in the West, and on the birth and baptism of the Lord on the 6th of January in the East comes into being. And what happens eventually is both halves of the church kind of borrow the other's day, and the whole church winds up with two celebrations. They have both days, which comes to be in the Eastern Church, the Greek Church, a celebration in honor of the birth of the Lord on the 25th of December, and of his baptism on the 6th of January, and in the West, the birth on the 25th, and then on the 6th of January, a celebration of Christ as worshipped as God by the Magi. So, the beginnings of Christmas and Epiphany. What is the great treasure of the 4th century liturgical literature, and many locally have heard of this book already, is a diary or a journal that was written by a Spanish lady named Egeria, who went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem in the 4th century, once the persecutions have ended, going on pilgrimages to the holy places where the Lord was born and died and rose and ascended, or going on pilgrimages to where the martyrs have been buried, Saints Peter and Paul in Rome and many of the others, becomes the thing to do in 4th century Christian life. There seems to be a great deal of traveling that goes on at that time, and the Christians take advantage of it as much as they can. So the Spanish lady Egeria goes on pilgrimage to Jerusalem in the 4th century, and she keeps a very careful account of everything she sees, not only in Jerusalem, but also everywhere she goes. And we have this treasure. It's called Egeria's Travels. And this is another case where there's nothing like reading directly from it. I'm going to read just two brief passages. One of them is a description of Sunday morning in Jerusalem, just an ordinary Sunday morning. And the other is going to be a description, I can't read as I have before in other settings of all of Holy Week because it's too long, but I'll read the description of what we call now Good Friday. On the 7th day, the Lord's Day, it's interesting, she calls it not the first day, the first day or the 8th day is the common Christian expression of the Lord's Day, but she refers to Sunday. There gather in the courtyard, and that is the courtyard in front of the Church of the Resurrection, built by the Emperor Constantine over the place where the tomb of the Lord is. There gather in the courtyard, so outside, before cockcrow, and cockcrow is when, of course, the roosters first start crowing, and it's roughly in that part of the world considered to be around 3 o'clock in the morning, so an hour before cockcrow, 2 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. All the people, as many as can get in, as if it were Pascha. They are out of doors, and lamps have been hung there for them. Those who are afraid they may not arrive in time for cockcrow come early and sit waiting there, singing hymns and antiphons. And what kind of hymns and antiphons are they singing? Antiphons always refer to the singing of the Psalms, So they're singing psalms. And the hymns refer, no doubt, to the very first of the Christian hymns, that in the 3rd and 4th century we have record of them. One of them, an evening hymn, is sung in the church to this day, Phosilaron in Greek, or the joyful light, gladsome light, hymn to Christ as light of the world. Also what is called the doxology, glory to God in the highest, we hear referred to already in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Also some of the New Testament hymns from the Gospels and epistles. So they're singing antiphons, psalms and hymns. And they have prayers between, since there are always presbyters and deacons there ready for the vigil, because so many people collect there. And it is not usual to open the holy places before cockcrow. So this is in the middle of the night, and before the church opens, for the official service to start, there's already a big crowd of people there kind of having a service of their own, antiphons and psalms. Soon the first cock crows, and at that the bishop enters and goes into the cave in the Monasticism. The Monasticism is the tomb of Christ inside the big church. The doors are all opened, and all the people come into the Monasticism, which is already ablaze with lamps. When they are inside, a psalm is chanted by one of the presbyters, with everyone responding, and it is followed by a prayer. Then a psalm is said by one of the deacons, and another prayer. Then a third psalm, a third prayer, and the prayer for all. After these 3 psalms and prayers, they take censers into the cave of the resurrection, so that the whole church is filled with the smell. Then the bishop, standing inside the screen, takes the gospel book and goes to the door, where he himself reads the account of the Lord's resurrection. Sound rather familiar for those who know Orthodox Sunday worship, does it not? At the beginning of the reading, the whole assembly groans and laments at all that the Lord underwent for us. And this indicates that what's being read at the time on an ordinary Sunday is not just the resurrection, but also the account of some of the Passion too. And the way they weep would move even the hardest heart to tears. When the gospel is finished, the bishop comes out and is taken with singing to the cross. That means they go to Golgotha, because Golgotha, where the Lord was crucified, and the tomb of the resurrection are rather close to each other, but you have to walk from one to another, just as you have to do now if you go to the Holy Sepulchre. And they all go with him. They have one psalm there and a prayer. Then he blesses the people, and that is the dismissal. As the bishop goes out, everyone comes to kiss his hand. So this is the first service. Now, we're not done by any means. This is just the early service, and it is what is an early form of what the church has always called matins. Then immediately the bishop retires to his house, and all the monks go back into the church to sing psalms and antiphons until daybreak. So we have services that there are a lot of people at, and now we have something that's done by a special group of people. There are prayers between all these psalms and antiphons, and presbyters and deacons take their turn every day at the church to keep vigil with the people. So that although there are monks that are there, the clergy take turns in leading the service with the monks. Some laymen and women like to stay on there till daybreak, but others prefer to go home again to bed for some sleep. At daybreak, so this is the time now between cockcrow before dawn and now sunrise. At daybreak, the people assemble in the great church built by Constantine on Golgotha behind the cross. It is the Lord's Day, and they do what is everywhere the custom on the Lord's Day. And I'm going to mention that in just a moment, because it's everywhere the custom to celebrate the liturgy on the Lord's Day, Agaria does not feel that she has to go into detail, because what's done in her home in Spain is what is customary in Jerusalem, as far away as that. So another crucial point that we have in the 4th century, the emergence of what the historians call the basic shape of the liturgy that I'm going to mention in just a moment. And it's the same everywhere in the Christian world. So in the church emerging from persecution, there is a form of worship that everybody recognizes. If you go on a trip from Spain to Palestine, you recognize the same thing. The only thing that's different is that in Spain it was in Latin, and in Jerusalem it's going to be in Greek. So Agaria is going to mention something that's different in Jerusalem from her home in Spain. But you should note that here it is usual for any presbyter who has taken his seat to preach, if he so wishes. And when they have finished that, then there is a sermon from the bishop. Because in her home, and mostly throughout the rest of the Christian world, you would have what modern Christians are accustomed to, that there is one sermon, one homily at the liturgical assembly. And at that time in the 4th century, it was ordinarily given by the bishop of the church. Generally, presbyters did not preach. The office of preaching was not extended to many. It was considered to be an essential function of the bishop's ministry as teacher of the church. And that's why the first mention you have of presbyters preaching is that they would read the sermons of bishops, great bishops, but they would not preach on their own till about a century later, when they start being responsible for churches of their own. The bishops are more and more in the larger cities, and the churches in the country or the little towns or on the outskirts of the town have presbyters, and the presbyter begins to act more and more like the bishop as the ordinary preacher and the ordinary celebrant of the liturgy. But in Jerusalem, all the presbyters, so you picture this great church built by Constantine in the usual style of the 4th century with an entryway, a narthex, a nave, and then the sanctuary with the altar, and there's a screen, and behind the altar there's a raised platform with the bishop's throne and seats all around for the presbyters, and that's based on the vision of John in the book of Revelation. And every presbyter who wants to preach can preach. And when they're all done, the bishop preaches. The object of having this preaching every Sunday is to make sure that the people will continually be learning about the Bible and the love of God. Because of all the preaching, it is a long time before the dismissal, Agaria says, which takes place not before 10 or even 11 o'clock. And so you have to imagine, since the liturgy began at sunrise, which in Jerusalem is rather early, around 5 o'clock, that means the ordinary Sunday liturgy is about 5 or 6 hours long. And when the dismissal has taken place in the church, in the way which is usual everywhere, the monks lead the bishop with singing to the tomb. When they are singing and the bishop approaches, all the doors of the church are opened, and the people, not the catechumens, only the faithful, go in. And when they are all inside, the bishop enters and passes straight inside the screen of the tomb, the cave itself. They have a thanksgiving to God. So after the 6-hour service, they have another thanksgiving to God and the prayer for all. Then the deacon calls every single person to bow his head, and the bishop blesses them from his place inside the screen. Then he comes out, and as he does so, everyone comes to kiss his hand. Thus the dismissal is delayed till almost 12 o'clock. Vespers is held in the same way as on other days. So that's Sunday in Jerusalem. Now, when Agaria says that they do everything that is usual, everything that any Christian in the world would find familiar, she's referring to the celebration of the Eucharist, and she's referring to a familiar shape that has taken form already in the first 3 centuries of the church's life. And no matter where you are in the church, this shape is what is followed. You have, first of all, the church coming together. Either they come together in some places inside the church building itself, or in other places they wait outside with singing. and they wait for the bishop to arrive as the one that comes in the name of the Lord. And then the bishop either leads them into the church, or they welcome the bishop into the church. And then the bishop goes to the holy place, to the sanctuary. He goes to his throne. Often there is singing accompanying this. This is one of the first times that we have mention of either the singing of verses from the Psalms, or a short time after that, the singing of the hymn called the Trisagion, Holy God, Holy Mighty, Holy Immortal. And then we have the bishop blessing the assembly, and then the readings will begin. And at this time, ordinarily in the liturgy everywhere, there are 3 or 4 readings from Scripture, 1 or 2 from the Old Testament, and then 2 from the New Testament, 1 from the epistles and 1 from the Gospels. Between the readings, psalms are sung. One finds this everywhere. After the Gospel, a sermon or several sermons are preached. After the sermon, there are prayers for the catechumens and for the penitents. After the prayers for the catechumens and penitents, they are dismissed. They cannot stay. If you are not in communion with the church, you cannot stay for the celebration of the liturgy in the church up until at least the 6th century. So the catechumens and penitents are dismissed. Then there are prayers for the church, prayers for the faithful. Then there is the bringing of the Eucharistic offering to the altar, and it takes 2 basic expressions, one in the Greek church, one in the Latin church. In both cases, the offerings of bread and wine are brought by the people. But in the Greek church, they are left in a separate little building with the deacons on the way into the church. The people would bring bread and wine. Then the deacons would prepare what would be needed for the liturgy and bring those to the altar in a procession that later is going to be called the Great Entrance. That's what's characteristic of the Greek liturgy. In the Latin liturgy, one has from the very beginning what is called the offertory. And that is that for many centuries in the Latin church, if you came to the Eucharist, you came up to the altar rail, because that's what every church had at this time, a rail probably about this high, as the ancient church have, both Greek and Latin churches. You came to the altar rail not once, but twice. You came once at the offertory to make your offering, and you brought bread and wine and money, oil, other things, for the needs of the church and for alms to the poor. And then you also came later to receive communion. So in the Latin liturgy, there was this making of one's offering at the altar rail itself. That was characteristic, unique characteristic of the Latin liturgy. Following that, you had the kiss of peace. Following that, you had the great prayer of thanksgiving called the anaphora, the lifting up, in which thanksgiving was offered to God for everything that he had done in creation and for salvation through the coming and death and resurrection of Christ and the descent of the Holy Spirit. And then, of course, the words of the Lord at the Last Supper instituting the Eucharist. And then a prayer expressed in somewhat different ways, whether one was in the West or in the East, asking the Holy Spirit to transform, to change, without any, at this point, theological speculation as to how this change took place, but nevertheless, a true change of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. And following this, there were intercessions, again, for the needs of the church. In some places, these intercessions came toward the end of the anaphora. In other churches, such as Rome and Alexandria, they came at the beginning, but there were always intercessions. Then the Lord's Prayer, the breaking of the bread, and the receiving of communion, and prayers of thanksgiving for the conclusion of the liturgy and the dismissal. So this essential structure, liturgy of the Word with entrance, psalms, and readings, liturgy of the Eucharist with either great entrance or offertory, the offering itself, the breaking of the bread, and the receiving of communion. One finds this everywhere in the church, from east to west in the 4th century. Not something that it took a generation or 2 or 3 or 4 to develop, once the church was free to do it, but something that already emerged as central to the church's life, even while the church was undergoing persecution, even before the church could worship publicly, even before the church was building church buildings. You have this shape of the Christian Eucharist. So in the area surrounding Rome, the liturgy of the Church of Rome and the prayers of the Church of Rome are followed by the surrounding churches. And likewise in all the other great centers of the Christian world. The liturgy of the Church of Jerusalem is eventually named the Liturgy of St. James, in honor of the brother of the Lord, the first bishop of Jerusalem. The liturgy of the Church of Alexandria is named the Liturgy of St. Mark. The liturgy of the East Syrian people outside the borders of the Roman Empire is named in honor of the disciples of Christ who are said to have first brought them the faith at the very beginning, Addai and Mary, the liturgy of Addai and Mary. Mary not being M-A-R-I, not the feminine name, but masculine name. Then the liturgy of Antioch is brought to the city of Constantinople by St. John Chrysostom, and the liturgy of the Church of Asia Minor is basically formed by, again, one of the greatest of the 4th century bishops, St. Basil. So we have expressions of prayer which are similar in structure, but they vary in the phrases used, the vocabulary used. Some are longer, some are shorter. But they all follow this essential pattern of the shape of the Eucharist. Then, and we find similar in all of the other central expressions of the Church's sacramental life, whether it's baptism, or the prayers that are offered at the various times of the day. And then I'll conclude this evening by another passage from Agarius' Travels about this. This is from Holy Week. At this time in the 4th century, of course, everyone has always observed Pascha from the beginning. The churches are beginning to observe a preparatory fast for Pascha. They always had at least 1 or 2 days kept an absolute fast, Paschal fast. But now they're beginning to extend it to a week in some places, to 3 weeks in other places, and to 40 days finally in most places. And that's what eventually is agreed upon by everyone. And they are keeping the week before Pascha as day-by-day celebration and experience of the saving events that took place through the passion, death, and resurrection of the Lord, especially through the influence of the church in Jerusalem, because that's where it happened, and going to Jerusalem is becoming the thing in the 4th century, and then going back home and trying to model what the local church does on the Church of Jerusalem also becomes very popular. I'll begin the description on the Thursday night before what we have come to know as Good Friday, but which in Agarius' time was called the Friday of the Great Week, the Friday of the preparation for the Pascha. They go to the church on the Mount of Olives in the evening. This is Thursday evening, which contains the cave which on this very day the Lord visited with the apostles. There they continue to sing hymns and antiphons suitable to the place and the day, with readings and prayers between, until about 11 o'clock at night. They read the passages from the Gospel about what the Lord said to his disciples when he sat in the very cave which is in the church, those words which the final chapters of St. John's Gospel after the Last Supper, chapters 13 to 18, which the church on Holy Thursday night has read from then till now, the words of the Lord to his apostles after the supper. At about midnight, they leave and go up with hymns to the top of the Mount of Olives, the place from which the Lord ascended into heaven. And there again they have readings and hymns and antiphons suitable for the day. And the prayers which the bishop says are all appropriate to the day and to the place. When the cocks begin to crow, now about 2 or 3 in the morning, everyone leaves the top of the Mount of Olives, and coming down with singing to the place where the Lord prayed, as the Gospels describe in the passage which begins, "And he was parted from them about a stone's cast and prayed," the prayer of the Lord in the Garden of Gethsemane. The bishop and all the people go into a graceful church which has been built there and have a prayer appropriate and one suitable hymn. Then the gospel passage is read when he said to his disciples, "Watch, lest you enter into temptation." And when the whole passage has been read, there is another prayer. From there, all of them, including the smallest children, so all the smallest children are up all night too with everybody else, now go down with singing and conduct the bishop to Gethsemane, the Garden of Olives. There are a great many people, and they have been crowded together, tired by their vigil and weakened by their daily fasting. By the way, I won't read it, but Agaria has a description of Lent in Jerusalem in the 4th century, which makes even a modern, rather strict fast look easy. And they have had a very big hill to come down. So they go very slowly on their way to Gethsemane. So that they can all see, they are provided with hundreds of church candles. When everyone arrives at Gethsemane, they have an appropriate prayer, a hymn, and then a reading from the gospel about the Lord's arrest. By the time it has been read, everyone is groaning and lamenting and weeping so loud that people even across in the city can probably hear it all. Next, they go with singing to the city, into Jerusalem. And walking, they reach the gate at the time when there is enough light for people to just recognize each other. And from there, every single one of them, old and young, rich and poor, goes on through the center of the city to be present at the next service. For this, above all others, is the day when no one leaves till morning comes. Thus, the bishop is conducted from Gethsemane to the gate, and from there through the whole city as far as the cross, to Golgotha. By the time they arrive before the cross, it is pretty well full day, and they have another gospel reading, the whole passage about the Lord being led away to Pilate, and all the recorded words of Pilate to the Lord or to the Jews. Then the bishop speaks a word of encouragement to the people. They have been hard at it all night, and there is further effort in store for them in the day ahead. So he tells them not to be weary, but to put their hope in God, who will give them a reward out of all proportion to the effort they have made. When he has given them as much encouragement as he can, he speaks to them as follows: "Now off you go home till the next service and sit down for a bit. Then I'll be back here at 8 o'clock. That's about 2 hours. So that till midday you can see the holy wood of the cross. That, as every one of us believes, helps us attain salvation. And from midday onwards, we must assemble here before the cross again and give our minds to readings and prayers till nightfall. Before the sun is up, the dismissal takes place at the cross, and those with the energy then go to Zion and pray at the column at which the Lord was scourged, before going on home for a short rest. But it is not long before everyone is assembled for the next service. The bishop's chair is placed on Golgotha behind the cross, and he takes his seat. A table is placed before him with a cloth on it. The deacons stand around, and there is brought to him a gold and silver box containing the holy wood of the cross. It is opened, and the wood of the cross and the title are taken out and placed on the table. As long as the holy wood is on the table, the bishop sits with his hands resting on either end of it and holds it down, and the deacons round him keep watch over it. They guard it like this because what happens now is that all the people, catechumens as well as faithful, come up one by one to the table. They stoop down over it, kiss the wood, and move on. But on one occasion, I don't know when, one of them bit off a piece of the Holy Cross and stole it. And for this reason, the deacons stand round and keep watch in case anyone dares to try do the same again. Thus all the people go past one by one. They stoop down, touch the holy wood, first with their forehead and then with their eyes, and then kiss it. But no one puts out his hand to touch it. They start round about 8 o'clock with everyone going by, entering by one door and going out through the other till midday. All this takes place where on the previous day, Thursday, they celebrated the Eucharist. At noon they go before the cross, whether it is rain or fine weather, for the place is outside, into the very spacious and beautiful courtyard between the cross and the tomb. And there is not even room to open a door, the place is so crammed with people. They place the bishop's chair before the cross, and the whole time between midday and 3 o'clock is taken up with readings. They are all about the things Jesus suffered. First the Psalms on this subject, then the readings from the epistles or the Acts which concern it, then passages from the Gospels. And those who are familiar with the Orthodox Good Friday services know it's the same pattern now, though not quite as long. Thus they read the prophecies about the Lord would suffer and the Gospels about what he did suffer. And in this way they continue the readings and hymns from midday till 3 o'clock, demonstrating to all the people by the testimony of the Gospels and the writings of the apostles that the Lord actually suffered everything the prophets had foretold. For those 3 hours then they are teaching the people that nothing which took place had not been foretold, and all that was foretold was completely fulfilled. And between all the readings are prayers, all of them appropriate to the day. And actually in Agarius Travels there is at the end the list of all the Psalms and readings that were read. So exact is this 4th century journal. And you will find that they are virtually the same as what the Orthodox do to this day. It is impressive to see the way all the people are moved by these readings and how they mourn. You could hardly believe how every single one of them weeps during the 3 hours, old and young alike, because of the manner in which the Lord suffered for us. Then when 3 o'clock comes, they have the reading from St. John's Gospel about Jesus giving up the ghost. And when that has been read, there is a prayer and the dismissal. After the dismissal before the cross, they go directly into the great church and do what is usual during this week between 3 o'clock and evening. So notice that there being a dismissal from one service does not necessarily mean it's time to go home. It just means you might go to another place for something else. After the dismissal, they leave the great church for the tomb. When once inside, they read the gospel passage about Joseph asking Pilate for the Lord's body and placing it in a new tomb. After the reading, there is a prayer, the blessings of the catechumens and faithful, and the dismissal. And finally, that is the dismissal for the day until later on that night when it all starts up again. So you see, and I wanted to take the time to read this whole passage, not only for those who are here listening to this teaching, but those who will hear it through the videotape, who have never heard of this book, who probably don't have easy access to it because unfortunately, especially in this translation, which is the best done by John Wilkinson, it's out of print and even considered a rare book, though I hope that condition will be reversed. And have never had the opportunity to hear such a complete description of Christian worship in the 4th century in only a decade or two after the end of the persecutions. That's why we must not have any idea that the development and elaboration of the church's liturgy was unknown to the early church, that it took centuries to develop from something very brief and simple. It's not the case. That the church has inherited from the earliest times a very thorough expression of worship that embraces the time of day, the day of the week, that sanctifies the year, and that finds its ultimate focus in time in the celebration of Holy Week and Pascha. So there we have two windows to see the life of the 4th century church. We've had 3 windows in all now. The window of articulation of doctrine, and now the window of the development of monastic life, and the third, the emergence of the church's worship into the public. And through all these we see what has come in the first generation following Constantine and the end of the persecutions. And next time we'll have to continue into the 5th century. And we can have some questions now.
You said that when the persecution stopped, they started looking for ways to build this martyrdom, and they started monasticism.
The expression of Christian life as sacrificial embracing of the cross, bearing the cross and dying, dying on the cross with Christ for love of Him is of course central to the gospel and Christian life from the beginning. So the issue is how specifically is this life to be lived out by Christians. The ascetic expression is one intense example of this. But as the church's liturgy developed, and since the question was asked about marriage, in the 4th century, there would be as yet no liturgical service as we know it today of Christian marriage. Rather, if you were going to get married, at least in the Roman Empire at the time, marriage as it is now was regarded as a civil contract. So you had to go to the marriage office and sign the contract, make whatever agreement was to be made. There was usually, in the case of people who own property, there was a great concern with that then, even more so in some ways than there is now. And then when two Christian people did that, and after doing that went to the church and received Holy Communion together at the liturgy, that was considered the ultimate expression of their being joined in Christ. And early on, we find a prayer of blessing being given to them, a blessing being given them by the bishop, but bishop or the presbyter, but not the developed. Now, the development of the liturgical sacrament of marriage as we know it now comes from basically the 8th century. Before that time, you have all the roots of that present, but expressed in a simpler way. And we read from accounts of marriages at the time that it was common, in fact, not only among Christians, but even among the pagans, to wear crowns at marriage. And the Christians gave a particular interpretation to these crowns, and they were not considered primarily to be the crowns of royalty, but again that ultimate expression of the cross, the crowns of martyrdom, that those who embrace the life of marriage will have their own unique expression of the ascetic life, the life of struggle, in that they must live a life that is a denial of the love of self and living for the sake of the other.
Blessed be the name.